Okay, good evening. It's 7:34 on Tuesday, March 21st. I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Board of Finance to order. First item on the agenda, as always, is public comment. We have no one in the audience except for a few members that are going to speak regarding some certain items. So, Jen, I assume, have we received any public comment?
No, we have not.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next thing, which are two different transfers here. The first transfer is to discuss and take action on a request for a transfer of $1,500 for a harbor channel survey. Our harbor master is not here tonight, but this was discussed at the Board of Selectmen meeting last night. And so basically there's a write-up that, that was included inside our packet here that basically talks about every certain number of years they survey the harbor going into Darien Harbor to check for depth and so forth, just given the amount of boating activity there. And so they're proposing $1,500, which is basically 1/3 of the overall cost, and that's being split by Neuro Yacht Club, which is in the back on the west side of the channel, the Darien Boat Club, which is on the east side of the channel, and the town itself. So this is sort of $1,500 out of sort of $4,500 that'll be spent, and this will determine what, if anything, needs to be done in terms of the upcoming further dredging to make it safe. I think this was supposed to be done per the article, per the memo here about 1.5 years ago, and it wasn't done. It was kind of put off. I think it was in the middle of kind of COVID and just difficult to kind of get things done. So I guess I'll open this up. Any questions related to this? Or anything I missed for those that kind of watched the meeting last night? Okay. No. So, and obviously once the results of this study could lead to a actual dredging of it, which obviously would cost more than $4,500, a bit more. So that said, I'll entertain a motion to transfer $1,500 from the Board of Finance contingency in the operating budget to professional services. David moves. Paul seconds. All those in favor? Unanimous. Okay. The next item under our transfer section of the agenda is going to be to discuss and take action on the request for a transfer of $40,000 for the Darien Police Department locker room expansion and renovation. Police captain put together sort of a overview of the background here, and there's a few other memos that were sent to the Darien Police Commission, as well as some architectural drawings. But I think by way of background for the public here, the Darien Police Station, and Rob, certainly jump in here if I get anything wrong, but currently has men's and a women's locker room. The women's locker room is set up with 10 lockers, which is the current number of sort of female officers that we currently have on duty. There's an 11th one that is currently going through the police academy, and I think will come on board here. We'll welcome on board, I think, in July of this summer, and so they won't have a locker to use. And I think as it stands right now, we technically have another female officer that's part of the Tokenique Patrol who sort of doesn't necessarily need a full-time locker, but I think this would bring the total count to 12. And so the police station's definitely in need of some expansion around the women's locker room there. There's not room. I think Rob visited that, and I think Brent gave an update to the Board of Selectmen last night. There's not really room to add another locker there, just given sort of how tightly packed it is. So I think the very preliminary plans would be to kind of push out either a little bit into the hallway or maybe push out into the portion of the men's locker room in order to expand, and they would bring the locker count from 10 up to 17. I think, if you look at this $40,000, this includes various aspects of the design, architectural fees, equipment consulting, electric consulting, the preparing of bids and so forth. The overall project, while it's not actually designed and everything yet, I think last night Brent gave the Board of Selectmen, sort of a ballpark figure that could be 100 to kind of low 100 $100,000 type project overall. In talking with, and listening to, to Brent Hayes, who's one of the police commissioners, talk, and I think some of the feedback, with Rob, and from talking to the Department of Public Works, who's currently overseeing this project, I think there were some questions that some of us had related just to the amount of design fees that are being approved and whether that fits with the way that typically the board has approved projects before. Usually it's sort of a minimal amount of design fees, which then bring in design like the overall project, and then we approve the overall project. I think the timing of this, while I won't speak for everyone, but I think everyone recognizes like we need to sort of expand the women's locker room at the police department. This is great that we've sort of expanded and diversified the police force, and it's great that we're welcoming on our 11th female officer this summer here. But the chief is actually at, I think, the FBI Academy right now, as well as some of the other staff that are all going through additional training and so forth. So he's not able to speak to it right now, but I think I'll turn it over to the board, and people can add additional input, and we can ask additional questions. But one of the things that was being considered is whether or not, in light of not being able to talk to the architect and learn a little bit more about this, if we might push this to Tuesday's meeting, where the police chief can come in, and we can probably bring someone in from the Department of Public Works and even the architects to talk about this a little bit more, and just make sure that we understand sort of how much is being approved initially for the professional services, and then how much would be part of the ultimate transfer right here. As we ask questions and think about the timing, what I would say is what's being proposed is that we would transfer this amount out of the Board of Finance, out of the capital reserve that exists in the reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenditures. So that would allow this to be fast-tracked, just given that this ideally really needs to be done in July when one of our new officers shows up here. So I think if this was to be moved to Tuesday's meeting, it could still be done sort of promptly, and those funds would become available right away. So let me pause there, and Noel, I know you've had some conversations. Do you want to?
I think pushing it a week would make sense. I think Chief's back, some of the other staff is back. Brent got caught in New York City, so he's not here. I think we could probably bring the architect in. That's probably a good idea, and the public works person who's been kind of driving this. I think this kind of came up a little late on our radar, to be really frank. From a cost perspective, just to repeat some of the things you said, $40,000 for the architect fees, $100,000 for construction, and my understanding is $25,000 for the 7 lockers we want to put in there. Given all those facts, I'd like to actually push this for a week. I'm one of the people that's kind of has a slew of questions, and I think I'm more comfortable asking Public Works and Chief and the architect all in next week, if you want to get this board some better answers, because I see a lot of faces, and I've talked to a few people who are just like, what is this, how much, why is the fee so high, whatnot. So I think we should give those parties a chance to kind of respond to our questions. I know Dave, I was talking to David just right before this, and he's got a couple of questions himself. So my proposal, if the board's okay, was just kick it a week. I don't think a week would be terrible in terms of timing. You kind of laid out what the timing is. It's July.
Yep.
When the female officer is joining, so it still gives us enough time to appropriate this and get it started. Thoughts?
I concur. I have some questions. I'd be happy to submit them to Kate or whoever in Public Works is the right person in advance, so that they have time to prep if they want. And obviously, I'd share them with you guys. I think you've seen most of them, but there's a couple others that have popped up as I've looked at it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what we're hearing here is we want to make sure that the first slug is to design it all and so forth, and to come back and just approve the entire amount, just because we do need to sort of move
Yeah,
quickly.
it just seems, I think, what I'm hearing is it's $25,000 for the lockers.
Correct.
Yeah.
And $100 for the construction.
Correct.
So if you add 40 to all that, you get about 160. It's
25%.
hard to believe that our design fees would be 25% of the total project cost. That seems
Yeah, and Dan,
very high.
I think your concerns are most people's concern on this board.
Yeah.
That's why the extra week, I think we can dig a little deeper into this.
I'll just say that percentage is not consistent with where the design fees have shaken out on either Oxbridge or HHR.
So I think we'll have some more information next week. I think we're meeting with the chief to go run through the police budget on Friday morning, so we'll be over there. I think I do know that the architect or consultant that they're working with is the same one that worked on the larger project back in 2011. I think it's probably fair to say when you're working in very sort of tight quarters, moving walls around, you know, it can be a little bit more expensive in terms of designing that, but 25% seemed like a lot.
Yeah, and I did check with our architect for HHR, and he said that for smaller projects, the percentage can be higher, but the differential between where it is on HHR and where this one looks currently would still be too wide for that, to accommodate for that.
Got it.
Do the architects do any construction management as well, included in their fee?
Well, I'll tell you the principal difference is the architects do the construction management in HHR as well. If you look at the architects also do a post-construction final walkthrough. So the two big differences that I noticed in the percentage payments distribution pattern between this proposal and the HHR proposal is the percentage of the payment in this proposal is 10% lower. So we have 30% of the architect fee gets paid during the construction period when they're overseeing a project. This has 20, and this project has no payment post-closing. And if the architect's going to be supervising construction for us, I would kind of like to have at least a little bit, hold back. And it's like if it's like when you walk through and you do the punch list, right? Is it actually built to the spec, right? And in the case of HHR, that's 2.5%, which is not a huge amount, but it's enough to get them to do the walkthrough and make sure everything's buttoned.
And this project's different, but we should still generally employ the same type of, kind of good practices that we have in other.
I want to make sure that somebody's overseeing it, because it's not the chief's job to oversee the construction, right? So we want a professional who knows about these things to make sure it gets built to whatever specs they put forward.
And you're just talking about the architectural design firm is the one that's going to be held to account for overseeing that, because there's several parties here. I'm assuming they're different, right? Engineering fees are paid to somebody else, right? And interior
Yeah, the way
design.
it's working on HHR, these elements are all part of the architect's fee, and then the architect pays these effectively.
Oh, they're subs of
these
the
other,
architect? Okay.
Yeah, that's the way it's working for us, at least. But yeah, the architect is the one that's on the hook to make sure that, right? They drew the plans, they make sure the subs build it to the plan.
Yep.
Cool.
And I think on page 2, they listed sort of, it was 15,000 for 2 different firms, and then sort of 8,000 and 2,000 for, so it seems like there were 4 others, but we'll understand kind of who's sort of GCing it, if you will. And I do know that it sounds like the Public Works Department is sort of overseeing part of this as well, so they may well be doing that, so we can have, forgot who that is, forgot who the gentleman is, but we can have him be here as well. It's probably good practice too, because just a reminder, like, we'll be approving this directly from our capital
Yeah.
reserve, so we won't be going through the RTM, so I think to take the extra couple steps here for 1 week
Makes
is
sense.
probably good form. So I will entertain a motion to move item 2 to next Tuesday's agenda, if that's good with everyone.
Just to be clear, we're paying for it out of reserve because it would take too long to wait for the RTM.
Correct, and we want to have this done ideally by July to welcome the new officer.
Yeah.
Just to be clear.
So I'll entertain a motion to move it. Rob moves it, David seconds it. All those in favor? Okay, done. Okay. So the third item on our agenda is to discuss and take action on a request to approve a donation of $15,000 from the Darien Little League related to sort of evaluating a couple of our fields. Pam, do you want to give us a quick update?
Good evening. So I'm here, as my memo stated, to seek your approval for a $15,000 donation from the Darien Little League to evaluate two baseball fields and a softball field at McGuan Park. They're well over 20 years old. They've started to shift. There's some areas that seem a little bit unsafe. They'd really like to move ahead with getting the evaluation done, and then they anticipate, they've already gotten somewhat of a quote based on the vendor that they've had to bring in for the 15 grand, that they have a feeling for what it would cost to go ahead with the full construction to fix the fields, and they're willing to donate that as well. But of course, once we find out that figure, then we'll be back again for seeking another approval.
Is there a sort of ballpark, no pun intended,
Yes.
Or pun intended.
estimate about what that
Yes,
might be?
30 to 40,000,
Okay.
beyond that. So very generous. They're looking to make sure that the fields will look just as good as they did when they first opened the park.
So will that come back in front of us to sort of accept the
Yes.
donation and reappropriate it as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And Pam, what was the timing on this again? When
So
was
they're
the
looking
award?
to get this evaluation done ASAP. Of course, we have to go out to bid for it. Once that is done, then they're looking to, so look at a figure there, we'll come back to all the boards, get approval for the final number, and then they're looking for late fall construction. So if we have a mild winter too, we can go right through the winter as well. So they'll be all up and ready in the spring for 2024.
Nice.
Any other questions? Well, please extend like our thanks, one, for not only donating the evaluation services, but it sounds like they're willing to, actually donate the improvements themselves. It's we are fortunate beyond belief to have so many gracious organizations and individuals in town, so.
Agreed.
And I would also say on that topic, I'm not sure if anyone's been to Cherry Lawn, but I saw the gazebo, significant work being done there, and I mean, it looks awesome.
Does look
Another
awesome.
sort of donation, right, from a family, so.
Yes, yep. And I played my first game of pickleball today
All right.
at those beautiful courts.
That's great. Well, I'll entertain a motion to accept and appropriate the donation of $15,000 and appropriate. David moves. Paul seconds. All those in favor? It's unanimous.
Thanks, everybody.
Ben, thanks.
Thanks, Pam.
Okay, next item is item 4 on our agenda. That's discuss and take action on a resolution to sell bond anticipation notes and bonds related to the Great Island acquisition, some improvements to be made there, the HHR improvements, as well as some other small capital improvements. So.
So we do have the pro formas that were in your packet. We do have them to put up on the screen, as well as some other information from Mark that may come up. So I'm just going to set this up so you can see it.
And just as a reminder, Mark Chapman's our financial advisor, advises us on all of our bonding, rating agency presentations and work and so forth. Helps keep us AAA.
That's the plan.
All right, so what you have before you is a couple of scenarios for a combination of issuing bonds and notes for primarily Great Island, that's the biggest number, but also for some other projects that are currently active. The way that Mark and I looked at this is kind of a long-term strategy. All you're committing to right now is what we do in 2023. So the scenarios that you see in 24 and beyond right now is just kind of a plan, an idea to move forward. We have a lot of debt between Great Island, HHR, and we were looking at budgetary impact, trying to roll that on over time so that we don't have a huge spike in debt service in any particular year by rolling on too much debt. So you see over the years, it's a combination of notes and bonds. But like I said, each year it's just a plan, so we'll be back each year to talk about what are the market conditions, what are the cash flow needs, what's the budgetary situation at that time, and we'll make a new decision on how much we bond or issue as notes each year. What you have in your packet is what we're looking at in terms of projects to issue for. So Great Island is a total of $85,270,000 related to, directly to the acquisition. That's $85 million for the purchase price and $270,000 that we've already incurred for some professional services, legal, appraisals, that sort of thing, so far as we've worked through the acquisition process. Then we're also including $6.5 million for Great Island additional expenditures, and you do have those detailed, some site preparation, repairs and installations, parking and access improvements, engineering consulting fees, and contingency. This is an estimate of what we think we will spend in the next year before we go out to bond again, and this is primarily for cash flow purposes. HHR, Hindley Homes, and Broyle. On each of those, we've incurred some expenses so far, so we're carrying a cash deficit. And then as we wrap up design over the next few months, we'll be moving into the construction phase. And what I'm proposing is really for cash flow needs to borrow what we've already expended, plus estimated construction costs for the next 12 months to get us through until the next bond issue. And then we have 3 small town projects, just reimbursing ourselves with notes so that we can meet our deadlines for issuing debt based on when we begin spending on those. So the 2 scenarios, one is, the only difference between them is how we treat Great Island. One is to fully bond the $85,270,000 for Great Island and issue everything else as notes. And the other scenario, scenario 2 that you have on your pro formas, is to split the Great Island amount into half bonds, essentially half bonds and half notes. So we do, the purchase price of 85 would be split in half and half, but we would bond the 270 of what we've already incurred. So it comes out to 42,770 bonding and 42,500 as notes for the Great Island portion, and then still recommending notes for all of the other projects. In attachment 2 to my memo, you have some comparisons between the 2 scenarios. The first page looks at what the combined debt service is over those 2. So if we look at fiscal 2024, scenario 1 is about $700,000 more in debt service that we'd be putting into the 2024 budget. It's about $263,000 more in 2025, and then several years where it's about $1 million more in debt service. So scenario 2 rolls on that debt service a little bit slower and spreads it out as we move through years where we'll have some principal, because of principal pay down, we'll have some debt rolling off and we'll have new debt rolling on. The second comparison looks at carrying charges. So it's looking at what would our debt service be as a % of our budget. And it's going to be similar results where we're going to see a jump in debt service as a % of expenditures. We're going to see that jump faster under scenario 1 and a slower progression under scenario 2. And then the third comparison looks at debt burden. So we show our general fund indebtedness as well as what the debt burden is as a % of the grand list. So what we are seeking from you is what amounts, bonds, notes that you would like to do, what the structure is that you would like to do. In the past, we've done, more recently, we've been doing level debt, and we can do level debt, we can do level principal. Those are 2 options. There's the option, these assume maximum deferral of our first principal payment, but that is a decision that we need from you. And I think at that point, I'll stop and I will see what questions you have for us.
Well, Jen, maybe just a couple questions as we sort of to help set the stage for the board. As we think about bond sales, we're going to do a bond sale, let's call it in April here. If you had to look into your crystal ball, when do you think the next time we would naturally come to market? Would it be a year from now?
If we do notes, then we're gonna have to come back a year from now because they will mature in a year.
Okay.
Right.
But even as you, like the spend down schedule for HHR, would that have us naturally coming back?
Yeah,
for
I
more
think
money?
I think we're gonna be on about roughly a year schedule. You know, we won't, might be a little bit sooner, might be a little bit later if the market is crazy and we decide we wanna hold off. You know, that's part of the reason for doing notes for cash flow purposes, so we're not pressed to go out to the market at any one time if HHR really starts cranking along or something like that. But I think we're in kind of a natural every year debt issue at this point anyway, because of the size of the projects that we have going on.
Okay.
Can I just expand on that? So, on page two of your deck, Mark, it's actually the third page, but it's labeled page 2.
Yep.
Because there's a cover page. So if I'm reading this right, so if we are to move forward with notes and bonds this year, we would also be doing notes and bonds next year. Is that correct? So we'd be bonding the notes we issue this year, but we would be also issuing another 29.5 of notes.
Correct.
So we're going to be coming back to market, to your question, we're necessarily coming back to market next year to do that, what is currently contemplated
At the
as
very least, you have
the
to-
second note issue.
You have to pay off the notes, so how do you pay that off?
So that's,
Yeah.
right, but we also needed to raise another 29.5.
Correct.
So, okay, so next year, if we do a note issue, we'd be raising $60 million through bonds or some combination of bonds and notes. Not just.
Assuming the
refinancing.
cash flows state that. So if
Right.
things slow down, then it's
Yeah.
less.
Absolutely. No,
If you
absolutely.
receive state grants. a
Just
lot
based
of-
on these assumptions?
Yeah,
Okay, so we're necessarily coming back next year to the bond market, is what I'm, whether we do notes
Yes,
or not, okay.
unless we did no bans
bonded everything.
and the schedule
Yeah,
that
HHR gets really
HHR
delayed.
slowed down dramatically, we would be coming back.
Right.
And maybe just one question, if I could jump back in. When we think about bonding, like let's call it the long-term bond, the 30-year bond, the idea would be, like we've done in the past, level debt service, but in the first 2 years, we don't have any principal payments, and we start paying in the third year. And that's what allows, on these graphics, that allows us to sort of take advantage of our continually falling, declining principal balance, or declining principal payments, I should say, in our current debt service profile. So maybe just for the board right here, as we think about, like, where we issue $85 million worth of long-term debt, we'd have sort of a 2-year IO period, is the way I think about it.
Interest only?
Interest only, and then we start amortizing in the third year. With the ban is a 1-year maturity, and you really only pay interest at maturity. So it's still all falling in the same fiscal year. You're just kind of paying it, it's a little bit of a cash flow. You just pay it all as a bullet at the end. The assumption there is if we then were to term out that ban 1 year from now, we would then issue a new 30-year piece of paper, right? That's what you're assuming here? And that new
I think
30
for the
years.
schools, we were assuming 20 years.
Right, 20 years on the school, 30 years on Great Island.
Okay, 20 years, but that would also be a 2-year
Yes.
interest only?
Yes.
So by doing, I just want to make sure it's like clear to everyone, by doing the ban on the school portion, we're effectively, because the school's not going to come online for a few years, right? We're effectively creating sort of like a 3-year IO. And again, allowing us to, you can see in these debt service charts, sort of stick it in there and have a level, sort of smooth out the debt service a bit.
Correct. And once again, we will, next year at this time, or whenever it is, we'll present the same thing, or scenarios, you can make an informed decision at the time. You're not locked into bonds and notes next year. Maybe it's all bonds, maybe it's all notes. It's depending on what's going on in the market and what's happening in town
Got it.
and the projects.
So as we think about bans, there's a couple benefits. There's just whether you're issuing a 1-year piece of paper or a 30-year piece of paper, and that's sort of a curved decision. And then there's the benefit of the ban. I mean, currently, the yield curve is pretty attractive in the short term. Then the ban allows us to kind of create an extra year of interest only, so it fits, sort of nicely like the Tetris block here into our debt service. And I guess the third reason, which we had, and maybe this was just to give the board an update because there's a lot of discussion around this. The other issue about the ban was, at least when we looked at this 6 or 7 months ago, was that could give us an ability to issue short-term debt if we didn't know if there were going to be things related to private activity, because then if you had to issue taxable debt, you always had the ability to sort of flex from a 1 year into a little bit of long-term taxable. Does it make sense just to give the board, since that was discussed a lot, like the use of bans to deal with any kind of private activity, does it make sense to just kind of talk generally about the flexibility that we have?
Yeah, we can absolutely talk about it. So we had an extensive conversation with bond counsel about private activity and how it all works, because it's IRS complicated.
Yeah.
So issuing bans does give us time if within the next year or whenever we decide to permanently finance the portion that we do as bans, it would give us time based on conversations with the community, what the final planned usage of that property is going to be. If there's something significant that would be private activity, we would be able to issue a portion taxable at that time. However, if we just issued, say, 2 years worth of bonds on that, we get up to 5% of the entire issue for private activity. So we're not gonna have private activity on anything else that we're issuing at the same time. So all of the private activity that may come out of Great Island can be allocated to these issues. Up to 5% if it's an unrelated use, something completely private that has nothing to do with what a town would normally be doing on property. But up to 10% if it's a related use. So if it were some kind of, I don't know, recreational activity, I'm at a loss for what it might be, but related use, we have more. So as we do go through the conversation with the community of what is going to be done with the property, we will have to talk to bond counsel. But yes, the issuing bans at least gives us a year if we see something significant that would be private activity that we know we need to issue as taxable right away.
And that private activity only applies to the 85 million being issued for Great Island, right?
No, so
It applies to the entirety, so in
entire
this case, the
issue.
one.
So say that next year you want to issue the other half of Great Island and 50 million of HHR. So our issue is going to be 90 million next year.
Right.
We'd have private activity on the 42 and change that we issue this year, as well as the 90 million that we do next year. We would get
Okay.
5% of
So,
that total
so,
issue.
so mathematically, that 5% is going to work out to be around $5 or $6 million in income that would have to be generated to get to that point, right?
Yeah, and it has to be over the life of the bond and present valued back to now and compared
Oh, so
against
5
par.
or 6 million over 20 years, present
Over
value
30
back.
years.
It's compounded.
Over 30 years, present value back at some interest rate that.
And it's net of costs
Fine.
and
So it's like-
depends on how
It's almost
contracts
like
are
net
written.
income, not
It's net
necessarily
income.
just
Yeah.
gross revenue.
Yeah.
So we
Correct.
would need to profit that much, and I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So this
And
is
that's
the oppo-
compounding. So
Right.
Yeah.
every year, if it's 100,000, so it's 100, it's 200.
Right,
it's
until we meet the
600,
threshold.
You know.
Okay.
And I think the way I think about sort of unrelated private activity is if you wanted to create a grocery store in the middle of the island.
Yep.
Related activity would be if, I guess maybe charging $20 for a pickleball court, right? Because or something.
If we were running the pickleball court, no, but Jim Palin Pickleball Courts wants to come in and run it, and we give you the contract to do so, and you pay us for that, but you're also profiting off of it. But it's a recreation activity, so it's
related,
related
yeah.
to what would be done on town property.
I have no plans to start a pickleball court.
In your spare time.
So I think, we get to amortize at 5 or 10% over the 85, plus the 6, plus the 25, plus the 30,000.
Well, if there's a piece of Great
Yeah.
Island in what we are issuing, then we can allocate private activity to it.
Okay.
But say that 7 years down the road, we've done everything we've done related to the acquisition and the improvements to get up and running, and that's done. 7 years down the road, we decide we want to build something there and rent it out. We're only going to get private activity on that new piece. It's not going to be retro back to the initial.
So private activity doesn't seem to be a material risk.
No,
Right? So
no, and
what's
there
the-
are ways to get out of it.
So what is the advantage of doing the amount of bands that are being proposed? And a related question is, I know this was prepared on, I guess, on the 9th, is when the
Correct.
deck was prepared, and
Yep.
interest rates have moved whipsawed
Yep.
over the last couple of weeks. I've got short-term rate at 310, 20-year rate at 350, 30-year rate at 395, based on just the notes here.
Yeah.
So I guess a related question is, how have rates moved on those three metrics since this analysis was put together?
About 25 basis points. So
To our favor.
To our favor, yeah. So the market baked in, did bake in, they were gonna raise the rates 50 to 75. Now, I was hearing nothing, then today I read something that said they're pretty, well, it's a toss-up between 25 basis points and nothing. So the market adjusted that 50 basis points to 25. So it's the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, and we'll see what happens tomorrow. If they don't do what the market expects them to do, then the rates will react. I don't know if it's going to be good or bad, but they will react. So the assumption is probably 25 basis points or nothing, and if that happens, then it might be a non-event. And then, muni rates, they do typically fall lock and step with Treasury. They move, with the Fed and all that. There's been a time and place where they've bifurcated, but pretty much now they're moving together. So if they do what they're expecting, hopefully muni rates stay steady. That's what I like, steady. That's why I'm in munis. So from that perspective, we're not necessarily, when we looked at these scenarios, it wasn't about private placement or private activity. It was more about budgetary considerations, be honestly, because you see the impact on the short term if you bonded all the 85 up front versus splitting it and giving you that extra year to push it off.
So could you just clarify what you just said there?
Yeah.
What was the advantage of pushing it off?
It helps you budgetarily.
Just the first year debt service?
No, it's, if you're looking at this, that's the comparisons, rather than looking through 26 pages and jumping back and forth in the scenarios. So it's scenario 1 versus scenario 2. Scenario 1 is bonding the 85 million.
Yep.
Versus scenario 2 is bonding 45 of it and then issuing notes and bonding it next year.
Mm-hmm.
The difference in the short term is in year 1, so in next fiscal year, it's roughly $700,000.
Oh, it's the
less.
third column is the
Is the difference.
cash
between-
flow difference.
Yeah.
So, okay,
So you get the benefit.
almost
in the
$5
near-
million in the first 6 years.
In the near term, now you're paying it
You're
off.
paying for it later.
Later, but that's in the out years, that it's,
Yeah.
it's, the aggregate is $5 million more of debt service. That's because the assumed rates in the future are higher. I do that to be conservative. They could be lower next year.
So is it fair to say this early savings, the combination of the fact that the 1-year rate is just going to be lower than the 4-year rate? So we're saving a little bit of interest on half of Great Island. And then the other piece is, if we do all 85 long-term, then we start amortizing all 85 on year 3.
Correct.
As opposed to if we split it half and half, we're amortizing kind of 42 of it, we start amortizing in year 3, but the other 42, effectively, we don't amortize till year 4 because we have the ban that gives us an extra year of of interest only.
And what I focused on was the chart that y'all put together with the debt burden numbers that Jen has. And if you look on that page, what you'll see is in scenario 2, where we do the bands, it has a lower peak debt burden overall and lower initial debt burden. So in the early years, the debt burden is lower than the debt burden of issuing all bonds, which is reflective of the issuance of the bands and the lower interest rate and the lack of principal payment. And then the lower peak, is also, good because it pushes out those extra principal payments to when the grand list is higher. So as a percentage of the grand list, the debt burden is still lower.
And I think that's part of just one question I have, like on the debt burden, and this is maybe how the rating agencies look at it. Do they not include bands as effectively long-term debt? And so is this only measuring?
This is just the bonded debt, yes.
Yeah. So,
Because you will be bonding all of it
Yeah.
at some point.
so I feel like the debt burden, and if this is the way the rating agencies calculate it, that's understood, but they're kind of ignoring the ban, pretending it doesn't exist until we actually term it out in
Until we
terms of
actually term it out.
long-term bonds, right?
Okay, cool.
So-
That, I didn't know that. Can I go back to the interest rate stuff for a little bit? Can you tell me what the 1-year forward rates are for 1 year, 20-year, and 30-year?
The 1 year forward, no, I can't.
Because effectively, by issuing the bands, 1 year from now, we're gonna have to issue either
Right.
more bands or bonds.
Bonds.
And the difference between the current rate for each of those instruments and what the market is implying the future rate would be, which is the best indicator we have, tells me how much interest rate risk we're taking by deferring.
That's baked in on your
Well,
assumptions here.
I put in 50 basis points, because I'm assuming, I already put in 25 basis points from now till April, right, if something happens, and then I added another 50. But that's not what the market's paying. I don't know if we can get a forward contract for a year. I don't know if a bank is willing, especially what's going on in the
Well,
market.
yeah, listen, I'm not a muni expert. I
I'm
know
not,
in
yeah.
other markets, there are data points where
Sure.
you can reference that forward curve. And absent any other data, that's the best single indicator of what the market in general is
I think it's-
believing future interest rates will be.
Definitely down from now, not
Yeah.
up. So I think the fact that scenario 2 is expecting us to wait another year and increase that cost by 50 basis points, and it's still saving us money in the long run, is like significant.
Yeah, well, I think his assumptions are conservative, right?
Yes.
I was actually looking to validate the fact that the assumptions are conservative, because I agree with you. If the Fed does 0 or 25 tomorrow, then that effectively eliminates upward interest rate pressure for some period in time, right? And that would mean that these would turn out to be conservative. I was just looking for a different data point, if you will, to sort of validate that view.
Yeah, there isn't a benchmark that does that. It's what they'll call, an underwriter will call price discovery, right?
Okay.
They'll go out to market and say, I have a 100 million Darien, we want to, they need the proceeds now, but we're going to, close a year from now, so we're
Okay.
going to do bands, and then they'll price discover it. So there's really not a benchmark.
There's not an established.
Because sometimes
market, got it.
when we're in a declining mode, then, the forward pricing is not that much. Uncertainty is what they're all hedging everything,
Right.
so they're probably gonna bake in more,
Yeah.
because they're not gonna take the risk.
No, I got you.
I think one thing is you think about like 2s, 10s, which is what they talk about, the slope of the curve is
Yeah.
negative now, right? So that shows that the 10-year Treasury yield is lower than 2, so that
Yep.
suggests that rates are going to go down. I think, Mark, just kind of talking to the desk today, if you look at where municipals are as a percentage of Treasuries,
Yeah.
in the short end, they're like in the 63, 65, 70% of treasuries, because they should be, because you save taxes on it.
Right.
And in the long end, in the 30-year, it's that they're trading like 90%.
Yeah.
So municipals are sort of performing a little bit better in the short term, is that right?
They're actually, it's actually converse, I think. So they're expecting rates to come up. We're 60% is cheap, right? It's really cheap. And historically, the numbers go back my 20 years, it's been around 75, 80. And everyone's, they freak out now when it gets to 70%, and the market starts adjusting it. So in the long end, I guess their suggestion is that by rates in the long end haven't really been moving, it's the short end that's been going. I think it's the indication in the market that's telling us long-term rates aren't going to be moving.
Right.
That's
Fair enough.
what
Is
Yep.
it also that money has moved in the short-term treasury market, flight to safety, and that hasn't carried over necessarily into the short-term muni market?
Yeah, it's definitely.
So there's just that gap has widened,
Yeah.
right, as of probably recently as a result of what's been happening.
But
in the
when
banking
happening,
sector.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
The
all the-
210 spread is negative in the muni market here too, based
Okay.
on the spread. And not material, 13 basis points or something.
Yeah, it's inverted. You don't get,
Yeah.
so from year 1 to like year 11 is when it gets back
Gets
up.
positive.
and starts,
Fair enough, yep. Okay.
So in terms of like the recommendation here, right, is the recommendation to do sort of all 85, all of the Great Island purchase 30-year, or a split between, sort of long-term and bands?
My recommendation is scenario 2, and do half of it 30-year now, and half of it is bands now, and revisit it next year and see if we want to do a 30-year for that second half next year, or if we want to roll the bands at that time.
And then the other items related to HHR, and the other sort of possible improvements for Great Island, those would be bands as well.
Yes.
So we effectively be issuing 42-ish of long-term,
Yep.
and we'd be issuing how much of short-term?
I ran it. Where's the scenario 2?
72.4
72.4.
of short term.
Yep.
Yep.
Can I ask,
Sure.
why is there a perpetual issuance of notes, notes and bonds of 29.507 in the out years for elementary school projects?
So that is for the 3 projects is 80-something million?
82.5, I think.
Yep.
So what we're doing is, because by putting 49 million for Great Island next year in bonds on scenario 2, your question is on scenario 2?
Yes, sorry.
So you would issue notes for the first piece that we're doing for the school projects, and then the cash flow needs going out to 25.
Yeah,
So we're
okay.
rolling those another year.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're gonna have, you'll have a $75 million bond issue next year. It's just, we're trying to smooth this out or extend it as long as we can. So then in 24, you're bonding the second piece of Great Island. The initial 23 million of notes for the 3 elementary schools. And then you're adding another 29 million of cash flow. This is all gonna change next year. When we sit down, these numbers will change based on cash flow, grant expectation. They'll have a better idea of what's going on with the grants, all those things. So what we're doing is we're just doing a series of bonds and notes every year. You can issue notes for 2 years. So you issue it in 1 year, you can roll them again, and then you have to make a decision to either permanently finance it or start making pay downs.
But this plan assumes we're only sort of issuing short-term bonds 1 year.
For Great Island, for the schools, 2 years. Which,
And then start bonding those.
and then
up
start
each year.
bonding them, alternating them, bonds and notes. So one is, the 29.5 is the balance of what's left over. So you're issuing bonds, it's a combination of the two. And we might get to next year and say, you know what, rates are really good and we're gonna adjust this. Or we're gonna get 20% in grants and we're gonna adjust this. The number's not that large, we can handle it.
Will the bonds carry a call provision, and if so, could you highlight the parameters of that?
So we're proposing to issue a 7-year call at par
And how much of a premium does that,
The market really, they've accepted
They're
call
indifferent-
provisions and bonds.
they're indifferent
issues
to
now,
it?
Yeah, and in Connecticut, we're seeing anywhere from 6 to 8 year. We're not doing 10-year calls anymore for especially credit quality of your size. We just thought with an 85 or a $45 million deal, last time we did a 5-year call, or 6-year call, we're just extending it one more year just to kind of.
and for municipal bonds, could you call it more than once? Say if you went out and reissued, or do you have to only, because I remember on refunding, you could only refund once.
Advance refund.
Yeah, so with the current tax regulations, you cannot do tax exempt advance refundings. You only can do currently callable refundings. So
Okay.
this will only, you'll be able to call these in 2030. If we call them and we issue new bonds, I will recommend at the time, depending on what's going on at the time, but normally I recommend that we have a call provision on that
Okay.
bond. And then you can keep currently calling them at any, as long as
Okay.
you have a call provision
Thank
in
you.
it.
It used to be a single advance refunding.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which you
Right.
can't do for purposes now.
Is there,
Yeah,
any-
they've changed that. That was a couple years ago.
sorry, is there any advantage to issuing a higher dollar amount just for liquidity? Or is there any
Is
advantage?
like a sweet spot as far as the par?
No, not on the, well, yeah, on the, versus like a $3 million issue versus a $30 million issue versus a $90 million issue. Is there, at some point, is there a premium paid to us because we're bringing more liquidity, a larger deal, more
No,
tradable?
I mean, some of the bigger players will participate in larger deals. So we'll garnish more interest,
Where do you think that cutoff is? Is it,
you're there at 40 million or 80 million, Citibank will show
there's no
up.
big difference between 40 and 80?
Not really.
Okay. And second question, what's the consequence if in the unlikely event we issue, but for some reason we don't close the acquisition?
So, well, that's another reason to do bonds and notes. If there is a concern, so if you have bonds, I'm sure, I'm not a bond counsel, so I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express or anything like that. It's not my purview. But there are remedies, I'm sure, to resolve that. So you could probably reallocate proceeds to other projects.
Yeah.
You could remediate the bonds, you can, even though they're non-callable, you don't call them for economy, for savings, you're calling them to remediate them, so you'd have to talk to the bondholders.
I know it's an unlikely event, but
Yeah, I would, I mean, it's,
you can't cancel it.
no, once we close, then the bonds are yours. So, but I'm sure there's remedies that you can reallocate the proceeds to other projects.
And at least initially, today, muni rates are at a much lower than treasury rates. So we do have the ability, like for the HHR bonds,
Right.
to borrow and then invest it and at least cover our interest cost as relates to that. I know there are other rules around arbitrage and so
Right.
forth that exist for short periods of time, but,
But if you're not exceeding it, so you're at least
Yeah.
covering
Right.
it, yeah.
Well, I guess to where you're going, Dan, is we're issuing $72 million in bonds. So theoretically, if we didn't close, right, all the proceeds would be sitting around a year from now, and we could use the $72 million of maturing band proceeds to
For
pay
something
down.
else.
If there was a material risk of not closing, that would argue for a strategy like that. I don't think there's a material risk. I just wanted to understand what the risk was.
Oh,
So,
okay, cool.
yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah.
And nobody's concerned about access to the market or liquidity going away or anything like that.
No, we've had, several deals this calendar year already, and there's not a lot of Connecticut paper in the market. There's not a lot of paper in the market in general, municipal tax exempt credit. So, we've been getting, on AA paper, we've been getting 10 to 15 bids on bonds of anywhere from 10 to 30 million. So, the appetite's there. They need paper for their investors. The feds are talking about raising the income tax on wealthy, and where else can you can park some of that in some municipal bonds, right?
No, really?
Hey, Mark,
Shocking, yeah.
who typically is our debt holders after the primaries buy it? Who do they, we have 85 out there now, 85 million. Do we know who kind of owns it, like a bit of
I don't. I honestly, I don't, because we've done, a lot of them have been competitive, so they don't necessarily share who they're, if all our deals were negotiated, we would see that. We would see who they're selling it to. But it's BlackRock, insurance companies, probably some wealthy investors, but.
When I was at JP Asset Management, JP would buy the bonds, and some would get allocated to mutual fund products, and some would get allocated to private accounts and private bank.
Yeah, at one point in my career, I was running some money, and I used to buy some of the munis, just get like really high quality stuff and just put it in the portfolio and let it roll for a year and just pick up some really good, this is pre-08. So when rates were normal, you had a chart up there with interest rates. I was like, oh, the good old days, 5% and 6%.
That's the thing, we're like, we're talking about interest rates and where they're going, but we're not thinking about, dislocations or market events or whatever we can happen.
Yeah, so if you want to, so I'll show you what happens with dislocation of markets. So in 08, when there was actually a liquidity problem.
Yeah.
So right now is not really a liquidity problem, it's just kind of a.
I did have it up,
You
right?
did, yeah, I
You
saw
did.
it.
You had it
Where
up.
did it go?
I don't think it's any of the ones you have up right
That was your
now.
MMD, right?
Yeah.
There we
Yeah,
go.
that's it.
So, I'm testing my eyes. So I kind of highlighted what was going on in the market, but the 4% line is really where the 20-year spot yield is. So our bonds are going 30 years, but the average life is about 20 years. It's 19 and change because of the level of principal and interest. So, we've since the last 10 years have really been below the line for a couple blips, but you'll see the 2008, the financial crisis, that was the first spike. That was major liquidity issue because of the mortgage-backed securities. And then when it dipped, that was more European. When it came down, that was more the European crisis. And then with the temper tantrum, and then we had COVID, and then currently, as of 3/8, was that we were right at 4%, and then the last 2 weeks, we've had the dip. So we're below where the 20-year spot yield is. which
And
is
next year, your
good.
20-year estimate is what?
Well,
Long term is 445, right? Is that?
Yeah.
And at any of those points, did we have trouble accessing the market? Could we have rolled 40 or 50 million?
Not even
no problem?
in 2008, which was our biggest, the year that we were concerned, because banks they stopped lending. That was when rates, we were seeing coupons of 6-7%. So that was the only year I was been very concerned about getting deals done. So we were worried when that happened in September, when it really happened. We had some clients with notes coming due, so we didn't have a choice but to go to market, and deals got done.
Okay.
Put a call in, and we've already called them since then. But
How bad was the premium that they were charged?
we're up to like 4.5% for like a 20-year bond, which it's high because historically you're at 4%.
Yeah.
Right? But the coupons in the beginning were 6-7%. So that's where it was a little scary.
So I think the current schedule has us going to market on Tuesday, April 4th, right?
Thursday the 6th.
The 6th.
Sorry, Thursday the 6th,
Yeah.
right? But I think, I sort of, asked Jen, I think originally we're going to maybe go to the prior week, and I had some concerns about, what happens if the day we want to go to market, it happens to be, one of the bad days we've seen over the last few weeks. And I think, and I very much appreciate, I think both Jen and Mark sort of pushed the schedule to have us have the ability to go on the 6th. But I think, Jen, if I recall my email, we actually end up having sort of 3 weeks where if something absolutely drastic happened during the week of the 6th, we could go the next week.
We could go the next week. I think the latest we would want to go would be April 18th.
Yeah.
That gives us 2 weeks to close on the bonds, get money in the door here on May 2nd in preparation for closing on the property May 5th.
So to the point of, are we sticking ourselves in one day where we absolutely have to go to the market on that one day? No, thanks for, with much thanks to these guys, we now, in terms of accelerating, kind of getting ready, we have the ability, if we needed to wait a week. Or to wait 2 weeks, and so not being stuck on a day where there's sort of turmoil. And then maybe, on that same, in that same vein, related to the bands, it is a 12-month instrument, and it's non-callable. But I think what the Treasury regulations do allow us to do is come to market 90 days prior to the maturity and issue new debt to effectively kind of take out, if you will, or defease, right, the existing bonds. So if we're issuing 1 year non-callable debt, it doesn't mean we need to be in the market on that exact day that it matures. We have the ability in that 90-day window prior to maturity to deal with market conditions.
Correct, because it's technically a current call.
Mark, is there any ability to issue prior to the 6th? Or would we
Well,
consider
we
that?
really, we're kind of, we can't. So
that's-
just from a timeline perspective, we've got to wait for the rating, the rating report, which we hope to have by Monday, the 3rd? Was that
Yes.
the 3rd?
Yeah.
So we need the rating report. So and I'm, even though he promised us on the 31st, they've been notorious late getting us the reports. So if we penciled in the 2nd, or moved it to that Tuesday, to the 4th, then I'd have concern about getting the rating, and then if we don't have the rating, no one's gonna buy it.
No, that's fine. I was just thinking there are still a couple of bank names that are kicking around as being, concerned. So, my initial thought was, if there was a possibility, you could do it to make sure that those things don't turn into a problem, but it sounds like we've got other constraints, so we'll just have to go with what we have, and Jim already addressed the fact that we can push it another week, so
Yeah.
we still have some flexibility, so that sounds good.
Yeah, if we wake up, on the 5th or the 6th, and there's another bank, then and we don't want to go on the market that day, we can
Please note it.
postpone it.
Yeah, we effectively have 12 days, and I think that's
There's some
valuable.
time
I
in the-
appreciate you guys
yeah.
trying to sort of accelerate
Yeah.
the schedule.
And the other consideration is, we're gonna distribute the document on Monday, the 27th, and we want to have it in the market, a good 10 days in advance, so that folks can, even though it seems like they're not looking at it till a couple days before, but I want it out there for marketing purposes. So if we consolidate, if we shrink that time, we're not giving them potentially enough time. And these are, aggregate 100 million, or roughly 100 million. It's over 100 million. It's a big number. So there's going to get a lot of attention, and a lot of folks are going to do their due diligence to pre-verify the credit. And I'm optimistic that we're going to get a lot of attention on this.
Okay.
And maybe before we move to the bond resolution, just one question. And I know in the analysis you sent around the pricing, you had sort of premium coupons throughout the curve. Is that where the market is now? And should we anticipate sort of premium coupons throughout?
Yeah. So when I baked in the 25 I'll call it the forward 25 basis points, it pushed us to 5% coupons.
Yep.
So and I think emails got crossed or something,
Yeah.
but if we were on current rates, we would be, they'll probably be 4.5, so 4, we'll have 4 handles maybe in the back end, but it still could be, it's still the premium bonds at the end. It just won't be as big. So instead of it being priced at a 110 or 111, maybe it's a 105, maybe.
Yep.
I just have one last question. These are AAA rates, and we know we've been worried about a downgrade. What's the differential? Like, if the average is 4% here, what's the spread?
It's about 25, 30 basis points from a AAA to a AA1.
They affirmed our rating when we announced the purchase, right? And you ran the debt by them at that time, right?
They did not. We never asked them to go to committee. We had the rating. We got to the you know, to the aisle, basically, and we ran away. We said, we have to, we extended the due diligence, because we didn't want to pay them for the rating. So we met with them this morning. Calls seemed to go well.
I think it went well.
Yeah, we didn't, you know, they didn't, any shots across the bow. They didn't seem to be too concerned. But they have a week to review us, and he's just one analyst, right? He has to present that to his committee.
But about the time that we presented to them last time and had them almost, just standing outside the committee door room, right? That was when the purchase price was 103. It's when we had already approved the approximately 85 million for HHR. So there's sort of nothing new in here that they haven't seen.
Correct.
Any new expenditures that they haven't seen.
No, it's actually better.
Yeah.
Right. We had another good year for the audit. We had grand list figures for 10/1/22,
Yep.
which was higher. So, from a financial analytical perspective, it's better. But he didn't sit in front of the committee. He's just one person. He's just one, he's just one vote. His recommendation, and then the committee makes the decision.
Got it.
He didn't seem to indicate there'd be any problem
No.
there.
So any other questions related to the bonding and the structure and so forth before we talk about the resolution?
Yes. So I'm on the use of proceeds, which is, Jen, Jen's memo is a 2-page memo, and the first attachment is basically how the proceeds are divvied up.
Yep.
So everything on this list, with one exception, we've had a lot of detailed discussion around. We've discussed ad nauseum the purchase of Great Island, and kudos to the town for negotiating a lower purchase price. But we discussed that ad nauseum last year. We've discussed Hinley renovation, Holmes renovation, Royal renovation, sidewalks, Town Hall gym upgrade, and the Hanson Road Bridge. What we haven't had a conversation about is the $6.5 million of planned improvements for the island. The first time that I saw, or I think our board saw, that the town intended to spend $6.5 million on the island as articulated in this package was when we got this package. So we just deferred a conversation or a vote on $40,000 for the police department because we didn't have enough information. We're being asked to authorize funding for $6.5 million of capital spending based on a spreadsheet that articulates site preparation for 3.7, repairs and installations for 149,000, et cetera. So I'm concerned that there hasn't been adequate discussion of this planned spending. Even though it's consistent with what we all expected, we haven't discussed it in any level of detail. So I'll stop there.
Could we not still discuss it though, and then adjust funding in the future if we weren't spending all of that?
So I think.
Depends on when the money's going out the door.
Yeah.
If the money goes out the door before we've had a chance to discuss it, then it doesn't matter.
I would assume we wouldn't approve any projects, right, until we,
Well, that's what,
Discuss it and vote
that's my
on it.
question.
yeah.
So, John, correct me if I'm wrong, I'd kind of break this whole financing up into 3 different pieces. There's one, the appropriation, which all the boards appropriated 103 million and change for the purchase of the island, which was that price. But that appropriation included to buy the island related costs, and it had some other, language as relates to sort of
Other
fees and
improvements
advisors
thereon.
and certain types of improvements or remediations around related to it. Now, the purchase price at the time was 103, and the bonding resolution was like 103, the appropriation was 103 and a half. And that appropriation was made effectively from the general fund. Then the second piece is, since the general fund doesn't have 103.5 million in it, or I guess at certain times, no, it doesn't. So we then had a bonding resolution to approve $103.5 million to deal with the purchase of the island plus, sort of expenses and those same other items, albeit at that time that the purchase price was 103. What we're talking about tonight is a resolution not to spend the money, but to go issue the bonds, right? The sort of all parties gave the appropriation to spend the money, to raise it via bonding. Now it's our responsibility to decide what deal we're actually going to allow the town to go to market with, if I said that correctly. So that now includes the 85 approximately amount for the island, plus up to 6.5 for these other related costs.
Well, to be clear, what we appropriated a year ago was 103.5.
Correct.
Which was intended to fund the acquisition of the island and closing expenses. It was not intended, even though it gave the town the ability to use the money for other purposes. It was not intended to fund other purposes. It was intended to fund the acquisition of the island and closing costs. The fact that the purchase price has been reduced by $18 million seems to have offered up a blank check to the town to spend as much of that as it deems prudent without having to go back for appropriations from this board, the Board of Selectmen, or the RTM, simply because we've reduced the purchase price. And that may be the letter of the authorization, but that certainly wasn't the intention of my vote a year ago to authorize $6.5 million of spending when we've had zero discussion on what that spending entails.
Jim.
So I actually am comfortable voting for the bonding, but what I'm not comfortable doing is implying that we authorize the spending, because it's, even though, again, technically it may have been part of the bonding resolution or the authorization a year ago, we've never discussed it. We have not at one meeting discussed the spending in any level of detail.
Jim, this is a funding resolution. Does it imply that it's allowing other boards, predominantly the Board of Selectmen, to spend up to $6.5 million for improvements, or is that $6.5 million just sitting in limbo waiting further approval?
No, so the full 103 has been approved. So that means 103 can be spent by the town to buy the island and make sort of improvements. And I want to just take a pause right there. I don't know if you have the resolution in front of you, but it's not any improvement, right? It doesn't allow, it's related to the sort of purchase and certain remediation and so forth. It doesn't allow
Putting a Ferris wheel.
to put a Ferris wheel on. Yes.
But by extrapolation, what you're saying is that the town could choose to spend all 18 million of the purchase price reduction without having to come back to any board for approval, because we've authorized that spending.
I think technically that is correct.
And that's
that the town they have the ability to spend that entire 18 directly out of the general fund. And it would be our decision to let the general fund run dry and not replace it with bonding. Now let's talk sort of reality, I think. What Monica has made clear is that any decisions as it relates to sort of how this island's going to be used and sort of, I'll use the word material improvements, right? That she was going to make sure that was publicly discussed and sort of involve the input of residents, right? What she has talked about needing to happen, and sort of some of these some of the categories that are listed here are things that they've discussed, like the road needs to be widened to allow, I think, Public Works and the chief and kind of everyone has discussed, like that road needs to be widened to 20-some feet to allow sort of safe access, two-way access in, right? And I think there's some other initial stuff that they need to have done, but I think, let me know if anyone sort of heard anything different, but I think Monica made it clear that there was going to be, as it relates to sort of development or investment, or sort of how the island is ultimately used and so forth, that was going to be there's going to be a committee set up and there would be sort of public input. Now the question is related to any type of appropriation that is included in the bond resolution, Jen, that needs to go back to the Board of Selectmen, that needs to come to the Board of Finance, and that needs to be ultimately approved by the RTM. These are only for the sort of somewhat narrow things that were identified and included in the bond resolution.
I would characterize these as related to the acquisition and making the site able to be open to the public. So reduced purchase price because some things were discovered during due diligence that need to be addressed, rather than having the seller address them, the town negotiated a lower price with the intention of taking care of those issues. That's included in here. And then, as Jim said, the roadway widening, putting in some parking lots, or you have to put in like porta potties, so that the public can actually go onto the property. That's the extent of what's included here.
And to be clear, I'm all in favor of getting the public access to the property in a safe manner as soon as possible. I just don't think this was a very transparent way of getting the $6.5 million out or funded. Again, this is the first conversation we've had about this, and there's no reason why this conversation couldn't have occurred prior to tonight when we're actually approving the bonds. So it could have been done in executive session. It could still be done in executive session if that's what the town feels like is necessary. And again, I go back to, I have a concern that while technically we authorized the spending last June, the intention of that authorization was to fund the purchase price and related closing expenses. And I would suggest that $6.5 million is not related closing costs, and it's more than environmental remediation. Or if it's just that, then we should know about it. And so should the town.
So the reason that you're seeing this is I asked the first selectman for an estimate so that we would have cash on hand. Jim is correct that technically these dollars can be spent without going back through the boards. In terms of cash flow, if you're not comfortable including the 6.5 right now and want to have further discussion, it wouldn't be the end of the world. We can operate without the 6.5 million of notes. But I think that it's definitely a conversation that I can bring back to the first selectman and ask her to provide you with more information, because there is work that needs to be done to be able to open it up for the public. And, you know, that's why buy it if we can't open it up to the public. So we want to make sure that we can do that. But I can bring it back to her that there should be more discussion with you about more detail on these items.
Maybe if we could twist that a little bit, what I'd prefer to do is authorize all of it, the funding of it, and then have that meeting before the money is spent. All right, so that whether it's a vote, because maybe it's moot that we've already voted on it, I'd like to understand the process by which the $6.5 million was identified.
And the breakdown thereof.
The breakdown thereof,
Like how
more
much
than
is on
just an aggregate
remediation,
number
how
on
much
6
is
different
on for the
lines.
road, how much
So
is for-
I'm fine voting for the resolution as is tonight and not reducing it by 6.5, but with the condition that we have a conversation, private, public, or whatever's appropriate, on how that $6.5 million is going to be spent before it is spent.
So I think, you know, a couple things. If you look at the dollars right here related to sort of parking and access improvements and site preparation and repairs and installation, which is actually a very small piece. The other two pieces, having talked to Monica about this, anything that would sort of fall into that needs to be discussed by the Board of Selectmen. In virtually every situation, because it involves sort of doing stuff on the island, would need to go back in front of like planning and zoning, because if you're changing roads or doing anything like that, that ultimately needs, will likely need some type of sign off from planning and zoning. And I think certainly Monica has said that anything that they do on the island, they're going to sort of involve that, they would be soliciting sort of public input and keeping them updated around it. The alternative would be that if we didn't do this, then for the next year, those funds would just need to be drawn down out of the general fund because we wouldn't be coming back to market. So I hear your point in terms of we want to make sure that dollars that we're spending, because it's never just about the dollars, it's about kind of what they're setting up or what they're leading to or subsequent, no different than like the 40,000 for the locker room. You kind of want to know how that's going to play into the next one. I feel very comfortable sort of approving the 6.5 of the bands because I have confidence that all of these three categories, or at least the two big categories, right, will be discussed publicly in terms of what is being done down there.
Well, the resolution has to be approved by the RTM, and we're a soft sell compared to them, and there should be more detail, especially for the amount of money we're talking about.
But just to be clear, this bonding resolution is not approved by the RTM. The RTM approves the appropriation of the funds, and they approve us or authorize us to be able to issue bonds to replenish
Well, then, for the
that.
sake of transparency for both the taxpayer and the RTM, there should be more due diligence behind this. Having been on the other side and having been picked apart, it's the right thing to do.
And notwithstanding the fact that what I'm hearing is that if we've authorized 103 million of spending, which would give the town an additional over $10 million of spending without that officially or technically we've already authorized with zero detail. So again, I go back to that resolution, I read it earlier today, that we did a year ago. It was 103 and change, which was the purchase price and closing costs. Yes, the resolution said and other improvements, but there were none articulated at the time. So our intention was not to fund additional improvements at the time. So maybe technically we have, but for the sake of transparency, we need a lot more conversation about this. Before the money is spent, not before the money is raised.
And saying this, same thing you said, I hope, a different way and to the same point, is if in fact the purchase price had not been adjusted and was still 103, we would in fact have approved 103, which will go out the door to pay for the property. And we would have to come back for the extra 10 or 15 million.
Or the 6.5.
6.5.
Well, the 6.5 for sure.
Yeah.
But how about the extra 10?
So you said it with a lot fewer words than I did, so thank you, John. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. If the purchase price hadn't been reduced, the $6.5 million would have to be authorized by this board.
Right.
That's right.
You make a good point. I mean, it's a technicality, and it would be common courtesy and good transparency and good government to be thorough in how we vet that spending.
Hey, Jen, can I ask you a question? So the previous number was 100 million plus 3.5 million in closing costs, right?
No, I think the purchase price was 103, and then we factored in 400 and something for issuance costs.
How much closing costs do we think we have? I don't think the cost of it going from 103 to 85 is a huge difference dollar-wise, but in terms of closing costs, is there a...
We don't
almost
have an
still-
estimate. We won't get that until, a few days before closing with what we have to offset in taxes and that sort of thing. So I don't have a sense for what the closing costs are.
Okay.
At a bare minimum, we know we have a full year's worth of additional legal expenses related to the transaction.
Yeah. I think that's probably flowing through some of the numbers we're seeing already.
So if you look at the amount appropriated to purchase the island is 270, correct? That 270 includes legal expenses and other specific closing related costs.
No, those are professional services that have been spent working through the due diligence to get us to the point of coming to the $85 million purchase price. That does not include any forward-looking closing costs, and it also does not include legal fees from the last month running up to the final.
But that includes
contract
legal
amount.
expenses since we started this whole
Yes.
thing. And other advisor, environmental
It includes what we charge to the bond authorization. So if you recall, when we first started on this, we didn't have a bond authorization in place. We did some appropriations and transfers within the general fund to fund phase 1, phase 2 environmental studies, some legal at that point. And then essentially July 1st, we had the bond authorization became effective, a little bit after July 1st. The 270 is what we have expended on services that have happened since we got the bond authorization.
You can see on the page 1, where it shows 1.299 as the deficit in the general fund, which it has, quote, loaned to the island purchase.
Right.
That 1.299, if you subtract out the 1,030,000,
30.
leaves 270, rounding here, of what's been spent to date, the deficit that existed, or I guess as of a month ago or whatever.
Right.
What's been charged to date.
So I would propose also that authorization we did a year, not the bonding resolution from last June, but the spending authorization should be amended.
So
Should be
the
amended
spending
to ref-
authorization and bond authorization are one and the same. When you
Okay, so
approve
that
them, you
should be
approve the
amended.
appropriation and authorize
So we're
bonding.
redoing the bond resolution tonight.
We're not.
No,
We're not.
this is a resolution to sell bonds and notes.
Okay. Well, then we should discuss amending, I don't know if we can once we sell, but that seems to me that the numbers that are in the authorization from a year ago have become unwieldy considering we negotiated a lower purchase price. And what I'm uncomfortable with is the notion that we've authorized an additional $18 million of spending, 6.5 of which we're discussing tonight, when there's been no discussion as to exactly what that spending would be. There is certainly, again, I go back to, it was not our intention to authorize $18 million of spending on Great Island without the appropriate approval process.
And I will bring that back to the administration.
Thank
But
you.
if we didn't authorize the sale of bonds, then there wouldn't be the money to actually spend. They would have to come to us anyway to use the general fund.
Yeah, but let's just make sure everyone's very well aware of how this works. There's a spending authorization, which allows them to spend through the general fund.
No, there's,
A bonding author, I'm
when we,
saying they're
when
one
we
and the
come to
same,
you and we
right?
have an idea in mind and
Yeah.
we need to, it's so large that we have to bond it. We come to you with a resolution that appropriates the funds, which allows us to spend them, and identifies and authorizes us to issue bonds to fund those expenditures. Then we move through the process, we've spent some money, it's time for us to actually issue those bonds. We've fronted money from the general fund, we want to reimburse ourselves, or it's 85 million and we can't front that from the general fund. We come to you for the resolution to sell and we talk about, are they going to be bonds, notes, what we're doing tonight, which has no connection to that initial appropriation and authorization. What I will bring back to the administration is to discuss with them the option to rescind the unused portion of the original appropriation and bond authorization, or to amend it to include additional wording with additional detail about what else needs to be done there. I will bring that back to them, but technically the appropriation does exist.
Yeah. And I think let's talk about what exists, right? The appropriation exists. In order to reduce the 103.5 down to something less, right? That requires the Board of Selectmen to vote on it, reducing it, then the Board of Finance voting to reduce it, and then sending it to the RTM and having the RTM reduce it.
Mhm.
So
It should go to all three.
it took all three to create the $103 million resolution, and it takes all three to reduce it. I think what I'm hearing here is people want to understand how these 6.5 are going to be spent before they're spent, right? I think what Monica said in her email to all of us was that she would make sure everyone knew exactly how these were going to be spent generally, right? Before they move forward and kind of what the plans are. These are not to create the Ferris wheel, if you will. These are to deal with sort of initial access and things related to the acquisition of the island.
Yes.
So I think, you know, you should take back and say, we expect to be kept very closely updated on how that $6.5 million is being spent. And if certain things we need to talk about initially, since the land acquisition hasn't closed yet, if those things need to be discussed in executive session, we can certainly do that. We have meetings 1 or 2 a week for the next 3
2
weeks, I think, right?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Let's move on.
Well, what about the difference between the 91 and the 103?
And that's what I'll bring back to the administration, to have a discussion with them on what the sentiment is of the board, and have a discussion about amending, rescinding, something on that.
The
initial.
consequence of that authorization last year, and coupled with the purchase price negotiation, was, the consequence of that was to free up $18 million of spending. That was unintended.
Mhm.
Okay, that was unintended, and I'll just leave it at that.
I will say, though, that if the purchase price remained at 103, this certainly isn't going to explain the whole gap, but had the purchase price remained at 103, there's a lot of this that, in the 6.5, that we wouldn't have had to do. So
And that's a conversation that
Yep.
we would all, I think, enjoy.
I will bring that back. All right.
But yes, to be clear, some of this is related to the $18 million reduction. Exactly how much and when and how that'll all work, I don't think is known at this point.
Right.
But we want to make sure, like, since next time we come on the market is a year from now.
Yes.
Okay, so it sounds like what staff is recommending and our advisors are recommending is attachment 3-2, right?
Yes.
This is the Board of Finance bonding resolution that allows us to go to market.
Before we go into that, I just want to confirm, we want to do level debt and max deferral on the principal, first principal payment. I mean, that's what these scenarios are built around, but I just want to make sure that we
Yes.
all are in agreement on that.
So interest only for the first 2 years after closing, and amortizing the first principal payment in the 3rd year.
Correct. So 28 payments, not 30, but it's over 30 years.
Okay, so we have structure, level, we have deferral of interest for 2 years. If you look at this resolution right here, you can see that in the first paragraph, John, to your point, like, we're issuing 91.7 of the 103.46 million.
Do you need to appoint the Board of Finance representative before you get to this?
Well, yeah, I just want to make sure we all understand sort of what's contained in this, right? And of that 91.7, 42 is being issued in terms of bonds, like long-term, 30-year final maturity, 2-year interest-only period and level debt service thereafter. And the other 49, the other half of the purchase price plus the 6.5 would be issued in bond anticipation notes with a 1-year maturity. Okay? And then moving to the second paragraph, Jen, if I'm right, the 7.5 million of the 27 for Hindley, and the 7.7 of the 25.6 issued for Holmes, and 7.9, I'm using approximate numbers, right, of the 29.1 issued for Royal, and 145 for a couple different projects, of which the aggregate authorization for those same couple projects was 1.015, and then 33 of the full 169 for the Hanson Road Bridge. All of those pieces of those authorizations would also be issued in bands, 1-year maturities with the same maturity date as the 49 even from the top. Now, those numbers I ran through are all what I would refer to as par, okay? Because the bonding authorizations that we give are for par. But the spirit of it is that was an amount we're going to raise, right? So we don't have a $103 million authorization so we can go out and I think the scale that you sent showed about 11% premium, so we're not looking to raise an extra sort of 11% beyond these authorizations. So do you want to talk about sort of how, given that we're going to be issuing premium bonds, how does that fit into this resolution?
I used the same wording that we used the last time we did Ox Ridge, where we were issuing for what we thought would be the last tranche for the project, and we didn't want a huge premium. So what we did at that time is last line of the first sentence, or the first paragraph, where we said sold to generate proceeds of no less than 42.7. That was the language that we used last time. If it's vague or not quite what you want, the intention there is that we would resize it. If a premium is offered, we're going to resize it to get just down to the 42.7, as close as we can to the 42.7 of proceeds.
The key word is proceeds. So premium is technically bond proceeds. So if it's $1 million of premium, then we're only going to issue $41 million in bonds, and the other $1 million is going to come from the premium.
So
You have to be, it can't be below that. It can't be
Correct.
only 40 million. It has to be, because you need that amount.
And that resolution says, like, it won't be below that in terms of the proceeds. So I think the way that we handled this before is, I was the Board of Finance representative, and when I saw the actual proceeds of that last Oxbridge issuance was within a very, very small tolerance of rounding up and down for $5,000 increments, was exactly what we needed.
Yes.
Right, and so when you go out to the underwriters and you tell them that this is, that you're going to show them the amount of principal amortization that you want in every single year of the 30-year bond deal, correct?
Yep.
And you'll be sizing that amount of principal in each year to create level debt service based on what you think sort of the market wants in terms of coupons and yields and so forth like that. And so when they bid, if the yields move around a little bit and prices move around a little bit, do you have the ability to kind of readjust?
We resize the whole thing, yeah. So there's all the amounts, every maturity, the aggregate, it's all got asterisks all over it. It's preliminary, subject to change. So we have, in a notice of sale, it's clearly states, so this will be resized after. So we award it based on the initial bid, and say they all come back with $1 million of premium, then once we award it, based on the effective rate, then we resize it for that $1 million. We reduce it by the $1 million.
So if the long-term bond deal comes back with 43.7 of proceeds, you'll lock in that winner,
Yep.
Adjust a little bit of the bond proceeds up and down using those same coupons and yields,
Yep.
and then say that's what they're buying.
Correct. I want to say it was like $4 million less than bonding last issue,
Yeah.
which is nice.
So is everybody comfortable with that? Like what we'd be telling, instructing staff to do for this resolution, is going to raise this much debt, but we're telling them clearly we want that much proceeds, and whoever is the Board of Finance representative will have to make sure that that's sort of
The intent.
as close as logistically can be done to those proceeds, but not less than. And what about on the bands, based on the current market? Are you seeing those as sort of pricing at premiums as well?
Yes. The difference there is it's only one maturity. So like the numbers in the pro forma is the net interest cost. So you'll get probably a coupon of 5% on that with a yield of say 3%. So you'll have that delta is the premium that you're going to get on it. And because it's just one maturity, it's a lot cleaner, right? You're not going to amortize $10 million over 30 years, right? It's but for a 1-year note, you'll set that extra premium aside, and it'll help offset the cost of the interest expense.
So in that case, if it's a 5% coupon selling at 3%, the bond would be like 102-ish,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And that premium, it would be my recommendation that you set it aside to offset, the interest, the debt service on the notes coming due. So you budget the full thing, but you'll have a revenue to offset some of that.
Yeah, we can put it in our debt service fund and incorporate it into the '24 budget.
Yeah, the good thing is we'll have this all done before the RTM
Mm-hmm.
votes on the budget.
Okay, and in terms of the maturity dates here, being in, I see they're gonna be in April, just given that we're issuing in April. Jen, how does that fit in, just because this is one of the larger bond issuances that we've done, how does that fit in with our sort of semi-annual debt service?
It works fine. We have to send, Webster pays our debt service, and so we send to them 6 months, what we're gonna pay in the next 6 months. We send it in July and in January, so it works fine.
Okay.
And the main thing is that the principal payment will be in the second half of the fiscal year. When it's at the beginning of the fiscal year is when it's a little tight.
Is that clear to everyone in terms of why we try to spread those? Okay. So, given that we walked through that, any questions related to this as it stands right here? And I think this is, as I accept the motion for this, this was all in connection with, us sort of delivering back to Jen, to Monica and the team and the Board of Selectmen here that, we want to really be kept up to date on, as the plans for this $6.5 million develop, we want to be kept up to date on how those are being spent, and if any of that needs to be discussed in executive session, we can do that prior to closing.
And on the
So it's not a contingency on this, it's just, this is the
On
sort
the
of message back.
resolution, are you the designee of the board?
Well, I think I've been it before, I'm happy to serve as again, but
Do we need a motion, or do we just agree?
You can just agree.
We agree.
We
I
agree.
If you're putting your name on it,
Anyone
that's what I
else
want to hear.
volunteer?
Everyone steps
I
back.
nominate Jim Palin.
Is there anything
Step
else?
forward,
Step forward, everyone steps back, I love it.
Jim, just be very steady when you're.
Okay. So,
surrender your passport.
so Jen, I don't think, do I need to read this entire thing?
No.
Okay, so the only amendment we're making to attachment 3.2 in our packet is to add myself as the designee. Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to approve the bond resolution included in attachment 3-2. Taylor moves. Dan seconds. All those in favor? Unanimous.
I'm sorry, who was the first and who was the second?
Dan.
Dan and Taylor?
Yeah, Taylor made the
Taylor
motion,
first.
Dan
Okay.
seconded, and it was unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see what they say tomorrow, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Marty. Please tell JP to be kind to us. Okay, all
Thank you
set.
very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's getting like the next item on the agenda was a sort of placeholder, if you will, for discussion review of the budgets. We're going to start our first sort of budget review session on Tuesday night at our meeting here. Given that we're basically going to be allocating these over 2 weeks, these are going to be sort of longer meetings. And, Jen, other than the approval or the transfer, or I should say the appropriation of the money for the locker room, that discussion, is there anything else that we have that's going to pop up on on these agendas?
The only thing that I didn't get ready for this agenda, and we can do it at any of the meetings, is the closeout of capital projects so that you have a nice new number for what's in the Board of Finance reserve for when you kind of wrap up your discussion. So
Can
my
we
hope
wait?
is to get it to you for Tuesday's meeting. If not, it'll be Thursday, because we probably won't be doing anything with it until the second week of reviews.
We had targeted about just inside a week to get questions to the town before the discussion. That,
Yeah, that works.
okay?
Yep.
Which means, I think, the first group is due tomorrow.
Tomorrow, right. And I'm going to resend the master budget file because we need to adjust the mill rate calculation. I'm waiting for precisely how much is gonna come off the grand list for Great Island. But there's also the possibility, and I've asked the assessor about it, of additional federal realty coming on, depending on when they issue the CO on the second building and how much of it can be allocated to the 10 and 22 grand list. So I'm trying to get both of those numbers so that we have a good adjusted grand list number for the mill rate calculation.
Federal retail is,
Across from Norotan Heights train
That's-
station,
that-
Darien
they just
Commons.
started.
Darien
Yeah.
Common.
No,
Yeah.
the one, Darien Commons, yeah, the
Yeah.
one that's almost done.
Yep. So we have a big portion of that came on to the grand list for 10-122, and I
Sure.
want to see what the
Updated.
last piece will be,
Yep.
because that could be significant.
And Jen, similarly, could you just check with him with respect to, given that Palmer's just started, is there anything that's going to go off as a result of sort of that actually being demolished, not earning?
We have to start calling it the crossings, right?
Yes.
Is the revale next year?
Well,
Revale?
Yes. 10-123, I think.
yeah. Well, I should say,
It'll
yeah,
impact next year.
this grand list will be, this budget that we set will be based on the October 2022 grand list, adjusted for a few of these things that, Jen's mentioning. The revaluation will occur, Jen, like later this spring, right? It starts.
Right.
And then it affects and creates a new grand list for October 2023.
Right.
Which we then apply to next
The 25
next
budget.
budget.
And so that's reflected in the property tax bills for fiscal '25?
Yes.
All these will be based on people's valuations that were set last year. Or, yes. So, financial report, do we want to?
Starting on page 1, at the time I put this together, we only had an estimate of February collections because the tax collector was still closing out. The year-to-date collected through February is officially $150,276,000. Through February of this year, we've collected 98.99%. Through February of last year, we had collected 99.09%. So we're running about 10 basis points behind where we were last year. So the tax collector's just keeping an eye on that, making sure that she doesn't notice, too much of a diminishment in our collection rate.
And Jen, just as it relates to property taxes, because one of the adjustments on the purchase contract is we'll be rebating some portion of, taxes are paid 6 months in advance. And so if we buy the island on
May 5th.
May 5th, or let's just call it May 1st, then we would rebate 2 of 6 months. So will that come out of here, or will that be used from the 6.5, or does it?
That would fall into closing costs of part of the cost of acquiring Great Island.
Okay. And similar for, I think, for sewer charges, right?
Right. Yeah, we wouldn't want to rebate it from here because that would skew our collection rate. And it's not a refund of taxes just for refund purposes. It's distinctly related to the transaction and the purchase.
Okay.
Investment income, cranking along. So far, we're $766,000 better than budget. We're expecting more than a $1 million positive variance there. That was shared with Moody's today. They were very happy to hear that we would have such a positive variance.
Just real quick on that, are we comfortable with our regional bank risk? I know there's some of it we can't avoid because of operating exposure, but
Yeah,
I haven't gone through the report.
We met with a representative, we use M&T, they're our operations bank. We met with our representative yesterday. I found him to be very reassuring. They're well positioned within their peer group, they're well collateralized. The nature of the loans that they make is pretty secure and conservative. So we're comfortable with that, but over the last, 1 to 2 weeks, we have moved a significant amount out of there and into treasuries. So right now we have about 24 million in treasuries.
Great.
Awesome.
Short-term
Yeah.
treasuries.
What everybody's doing.
Yeah, I think our longest maturity is to July.
Great.
That's
Thank you.
fantastic.
And I think that's obviously a change in credit, but it's also a big pickup in yield
Yes.
as well, just given where the,
Yeah.
so.
Short term.
I know you guys put a lot of work into that, so thank you all.
You're welcome. What else? Not much on the revenue side. Town clerk, I think we're gonna be on track. I didn't update the note, but I think we're gonna be on track to meet budget on that. We're not gonna see the huge surpluses, positive variances that we saw the last couple of years. But we did bump it up 200,000 from our normal 1.6, and I think we'll meet the 1.8. And then building permits, our base permit revenue is doing really well. It's where we would expect to be. We had about 1.2 million of base permit revenue. In terms of the redevelopment projects, there will likely be demolition permits for Corbin and Palmer's that are pulled this year. And at the time that I got the information, it was about a week or two ago, I want to say that was estimated to be 70 to 90,000 in permit revenue. And then the next phase of that will be foundation permits. And depending on weather and conditions and how quickly they can move, those can kind of fall into maybe next year or maybe this year. So I had sent information to the people assigned to the building department to share that information, but we should definitely look at the building permit revenue number that's in the fiscal '24 budget. We'll pick up a little bit in fiscal '23, but I think the bulk will be in '24, and we can bump that number up.
And Jen, is that both, the Q is going up, but I think the RTM just passed the price change?
Planning and zoning's application fees.
Okay,
So that's a very minimal
okay.
portion. Building is the big numbers. On the expenditure side, things are tracking as we would expect for this time of year. There's nothing that's causing concern.
Can I just ask a quick question about property tax collections? If they aren't gonna collect 100%, does the remainder of what is not collected typically come in the following year?
Most of it comes in the following year. Some of it languishes for a few years. When we look back on our uncollectible, probably 2 to 3 years back is when we have maybe a couple $100 left. The bulk of it tends to come in the first year after, and then we usually have a sizable amount that will come in on the second year, but by then it's mostly all collected.
Does the amount that's collected in the subsequent year, is that included in the percent collected?
No, what you see in the property tax line there is only current collections.
That makes sense.
If they don't pay it in the current year, it goes into prior, and that we show as part of the other taxes line, kind of middle of the revenue section.
Good, thank you.
So nothing else on expenditures. On state revenues, big number there is the special ed excess cost reimbursement. We've gotten our first payment on that, which is 75% of what we expect to receive, so we expect to receive about 2.4. Board of Ed budgeted just under 2.1. And the increased reimbursement is that the per pupil threshold was lowered, and they had some new claims that's generating some more reimbursement.
I think Rich also mentioned, that there were certain expenditures that weren't necessarily sort of, approved by the state, and all of a sudden they became approved.
I think there was a school or a facility that hadn't
Yeah.
been an allowed one before, or eligible, I should say eligible, and now it is.
Yeah.
And I think that contributed to some that we got in fiscal '22 as well as some that we're getting in '23. Contingency, there's not much there. If you approve the PD locker room, your capital reserve will be at just under 470,000, but like I said, we're gonna do the capital closeouts, so that will go up somewhat. I haven't had a chance to comb through the responses and see if there's anything significant. Sewer fund is doing well, it's as we would expect for this time of year. Parking fund is holding its own. Little by little, daily parking is creeping up a little bit, slowly but surely, so I think that fund is gonna be okay. We may experience a small deficit in it this year. Last year, we had about a $30,000 surplus. I think we're going to be pretty close to even this year, but it does have a almost $500,000 fund balance. So if it does have a deficit, it can handle it. We won't have to rely on the general fund to cover any of that.
And I think the Board of Selectmen, did they approve, I think, one extra
Yes,
full
and-
FTE or partial FTE coming out of this fund?
Full parking ranger. I think we've been operating with just the half FTE split between the general fund and the parking fund. And then the recreation program fund looks very healthy right now. They have opened up their spring, summer registrations, so their year-to-date collected is actually more than what we expected, but this is our first year with the fund. But likewise, like we've seen in the general fund, and the reason for setting this up is when revenues are up, expenses are up. But what we did budget, I think it was a $275,000, we expect a $275,000 delta between the revenues and the expenses in here, that whatever that number is, when we close out the books, we'll go over to the general fund.
Jen, in terms of maybe just an additional fund, because we did approve a special revenue fund associated with Great Island,
Yep.
which will become effective, whatever, like May 5th. So
Yeah, we
maybe
can
if
add that on.
Maybe we just add that on, and just sort of refresher. That was meant to kind of capture revenues and sort of expenditures that would need to go against those revenues.
What revenues are there?
What?
I forget what revenues are generated there.
There's some
Rental
short-term
income.
money.
Oh,
Really?
going forward. Oh,
Yeah,
that's
residential
right.
and equestrian.
Yeah.
And then capital, these numbers really are what informed the recommended borrowing for the bond and note issue. Most of them are doing really well. We're keeping on top of our issuing deadlines. This has actually been a very good tool for tracking our capital projects. The one that's not up to date yet because it hasn't been approved by the RTM is the increase to the high school track. So that still shows on here as 451, but the RTM will be taking that up and increasing that appropriation. So once they approve it, we'll bump it up. And then ARPA, we're coming up on our next reporting deadline. Yay. We have spent a total of $328,000, almost $329,000. Our big items are within DPW. We have a couple of drainage projects, other large pipelining, sanitary sewer type projects. So once those get moving, we'll see the expenditures going a little bit faster. And any questions?
When is the ARPA fund reporting deadline?
April 30th, I think.
Okay.
I think it's the end of April.
And we have
My
till
brother's
the end of
birthday.
next year.
Funds obligated by the end of, there's a footnote here.
Yeah, I could never remember, so I added a
Funds
footnote for
obligated
us.
12/31/24
And spent 2 years later.
Yep.
2 years.
2 years later.
Okay. Any other questions on the financial report? Okay. Last items on the agenda are the approval of 3 different minutes. I can entertain a single motion on all 3, unless anyone. Okay, so is there a motion to approve the minutes of February 13th, March 7th, and March 4th? Dan moves. David seconds. All those in favor? Unanimous? Anyone abstaining? Also. So I think special assignments, I mean, anything, material update on HHR, David?
We're meeting tomorrow to approve the final construction documents and final budgets, construction budgets that will be used to go before OSCG and R for the final approvals there. We're expecting to get those sometime in April, and that will allow us to go to bid so that the process can move forward. Assuming all goes to foil, we will be prepared to break ground on July 13th this summer on the projects. And just we did arrange, a little kind of detail that could have got lost in the process. We did arrange to get the portable from homes to be used by the fire commission at the training facility. Put them in touch with Mike Vitti, and he's already met with Kevin Minbrett to arrange for that. And Mike is actually prepared to move it off-site the week after school closes. So that would meet the deadline to get it off the property before the 13th comes.
Great, we should have a parade and escorts.
Well, it will also save us some money, because there's money in the budget to demo those items. So we won't have to demo them, so that will save us a couple bucks.
Good job.
Okay. Rob, anything on IT?
Had our last meeting, last meeting, so the committee's gonna be disbanded after this. I believe, Jen, there's a recap memo coming?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think John's gonna run it.
Yeah.
So when I get that, I'll circulate it to the group. But basically, after 18 months, it felt like, we've kind of run its course and put a bunch of things in place. And like I said, I'll get the recap memo when John writes it and circulate it. If you get it before I do, you can circulate it to the group, please.
Sure.
So-
Nothing on audit, too.
So for that, has any of that stuff been implemented yet? Or we get the recap memo with the recommendations and then it remains to be implemented?
Latter.
Okay.
Although I think the policies did go to the Board of Selectmen.
Some of them
There
did,
were
yeah.
some policy changes that went to Board of Selectmen. But I think most of it is to be implemented.
Yeah. The survey went well. I think there was a bunch of things that came out of that. And I think the website's going to be
Yep, that's in the works.
upgraded over the next 6 months. If
Yeah.
I remember what I heard, right?
Yep.
In stages. As
And are we going to be consolidating the credit card payment processing?
That was not part of
yeah,
this.
it wasn't the scope. Somewhere Jack just
Jack
had,
put you
fell
up to
off
that,
his
yeah.
chair.
No, Jack didn't.
Check that
put me up to
nameplate.
it.
I know. No.
I covered the credit card.
No, I think
companies
that's-
for a while,
that's gotta
so
go.
I just-
That's back on the agenda. I think at some point we got to look at that again.
I think that's an animal in and of itself.
Yeah.
So to
Well,
speak.
just evaluating
A weasel?
available methods of payment for services at Town Hall with the full array of what is available and how we arrange that, at some point, that seems like a good idea.
So in the fiscal '24 budget, we included $25,000 in the IT department for professional services, with the expectation that some of the recommendations that come out of the IT steering committee will need some professional assistance on implementing those. So there are funds for consultants and that sort of thing in the proposed budget.
That's not what Rob does?
Excuse me.
And I just want to,
I'll tell you that.
I think Rob said there's nothing on audit, but there is, we have an RFP out. Responses are due on Monday. So,
Any bites so far?
I did do the courtesy heads up to CLA just to let them know that we were going out, and they said that, they'd be eager to keep working with us, so I think we can expect a response from them. And I did have an inquiry and a couple of questions from one, I want to say Markham, but those are the only two that I've heard from. But we usually don't get them until just before the deadline anyway.
Cool. Thanks for the update.
John, anything on contract negotiation or, okay. Anything on pension?
Nothing on pension, but last week, the Public Utilities Commission in Connecticut ruled on the Aquarian request for a 20% rate increase over 2 years, and they said no, decrease rates. So I don't have the definitive on what the rate decrease is. I'll get it out and send it out to you guys so you can read the summary.
So the letter they
And
sent is
I was
not-
lucky enough to be on the tour of the schools on Saturday, and for Mr. Baumgartner, here's the present, your annual present.
From Mrs. Hendrickson.
Yes.
Thank you, thank you.
It's heaps. I don't think he wants to share.
Apparently, you and I share this,
I don't have any of them.
okay, all right,
But also on Saturday, on Duke's recommendation and Superintendent Adley's, I attended Newsies. It was a fantastic play, and it was, everybody just had fun. The crowd, the cast, and it was gratifying to see. And I told Duke after, because he went to the same performance, I said, I spent too much time on the football field. I should have been doing some of this. And, it's great to see stuff going on at the school where you don't keep scores, that you watch another part of the school activities, and it was really great.
I would second that. We saw it on Friday night, and it was a phenomenal production. And in the tour on Saturday, they reiterated the fact that the technology they're using for sound and lights and stuff like that is 20 years old now.
Yeah.
And that particular production, from time to time, had as many as 30 kids on stage, and trying to balance
40 or 50, I think.
Yeah, balance the sound and the lighting and all those kinds of things with 20-year-old technology. It's a long-winded way of saying the Board of Ed has money in their budget for improvements to the auditorium for that technology, and I think it's awesome.
Well, and also to go back to Theater 308, my wife and I saw Wicked in January, and the musical director of Wicked was in Theater 308 about 15 or 20 years ago, Dan Mishke.
Wow.
Wow. That's
And
cool.
he's been musical director of that for 6 to 8 years.
It's amazing what they put on up there. I think, and the Board of Ed also pointed out, not only do they have like the theater class, they actually have a class, I guess, that deals with the technology of operating all the
kids-
lighting
the
and
kids
music and
love
so
that,
forth.
yeah.
So it is amazing the number of kids involved in the program, so.
And one other thing, I don't take this as a slight, but I was left off the list of reviewers.
You don't have any work to do.
You weren't supposed- I'm surprised you opened your mouth.
So I'll be a consultant.
Hey,
$25,000.
Hey, Paul, you can have police, public works.
Unpaid consultant.
I'll check.
Boy, there's not too many times that Jim's speechless, but you just got
No chairman's comments tonight.
I'll
go
send
back
you
and
my
I'll
revised
compare
one.
it to
You gotta
the-
have mine.
What we originally sent around, but
Okay.
Move to adjourn?
that's it.
Second?
No chairman's comments, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. John moves, David seconds, all those in favor? Meeting's adjourned.